Hello, my name's Jackie and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, I'm an aspiring writer who is currently doing a plotting experiment where I'm trying to plot out 3 different book ideas with The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. Voila! If you are not new here, you'll know that this is a slightly different location to usual. My husband and I are on holiday in Cyprus this week. Someone is hammering something nearby. I don't know if you can hear it. Anyway, my husband and I are on holiday in Cyprus this week, so obviously the number one priority is to relax, but I have had a rather challenging couple of months at getting this done just because of lots of other priorities, so I'm hoping I can catch up this week. So I've already looked at the premise chapter and the structure chapter of this book, so if you're curious about that process and would like to see how I went, I will include the links to those videos in the description below. And this week I'm looking at character. Now, character is a very challenging chapter, I suppose. So premise and structure were fairly straightforward in that you had a straightforward set of steps in order to finish the chapter, whereas character has a lot of content and a lot of different steps, and sometimes it feels like you're trying to do the same thing from different angles, which is challenging, especially as someone who's tend to be more plot-oriented than character-oriented in her work. I did try rereading this chapter before I started any of the exercises, and there's so much in here I can't remember, so I'm just going to flip through and tell you what we need to do in order to flesh out our characters based on John Truby's method. The biggest conceptual thing he starts with is the idea of a character web rather than your protagonist and maybe even antagonist just sitting there in this world with no one else. And one of the things he says is the single biggest mistake writers make when creating characters is they think of their hero and all other characters as separate individuals. Their hero is alone in a vacuum, unconnected to others. The result is not only a weak hero, but also cardboard opponents and minor characters who are even weaker. To create great characters, think of all your characters as part of a web in which each helps define the others. To put it another way, a character is often defined by who he is not. So we can see that this isn't going to simply be a list of character profiles, figuring out who each of the people are. We're going to figure out how they work together, which is something I've never done before, so I'm nervous and excited. When it comes to the projects I'm going to be working on, one is a book I've actually already drafted. I originally wrote it when I was 19, lived in my head for over 10 years, and then last year for Camp NaNoWriMo I attempted to rewrite it. The second one is an idea that I plotted out for NaNoWriMo last year, but I didn't end up writing. And since starting this exercise, I've realized that the main reason I didn't end up writing it was because I didn't actually have that much in the outline. So I'm basically starting from scratch. And then there's a third idea, which I am completely starting from scratch. Codenames for reference. First one I'm going with Fantasy Hot Mess, because there is so much in there and I don't know how to make it work. And I cannot distill it down to a single statement. Second one is Happily Ever After. It's about a villain who ends up in hell and wants to take over heaven. And the third one is DID Mystery. So it's a murder mystery from the point of view of someone with dissociative identity disorder, and all of her alters are trying to figure out who the killer is. For the rest of this video, I'm going to be attempting each of these exercises for each of these books. In my time, I'm going to be going through the entire chapter for each book. In your time, I think I'm going to edit this so I have clips from each exercise for each book in the same section, so we can look at each exercise as a single unit. So let's get started. Exercise 1 is figuring out who all of your major characters are, and he has 2 approaches to start this. One is based on their function in the story. So function might be they are the hero or protagonist, the opponent or antagonist, an ally, so the hero's helper, fake ally opponent. This is someone who appears to be a friend but is actually an opponent. And then a fake opponent ally, so someone who appears to be an opponent but is actually helping the hero. And a subplot character. The second approach he has for figuring out who your characters are is listing them by archetype. And he lists a few archetypes as examples here, however there are far more archetypes beyond this if you like this approach. So the first one is king or father, queen or mother, wise old man / woman / mentor / teacher, warrior, magician or shaman, trickster, and artist or clown. I think I'm going to try both approaches, but I prefer the idea of looking at a character based on their function in the story rather than an archetype, just because I feel like my characters are too complex to be archetypes. Not that I'm a great character creator or anything, but I do tend to have very grey perspectives in life. I in the past I've had fairly great characters and it's very hard to slot them into one particular role, whereas function in the story, whether someone is like the hero or opponent, really just depends on the point of view as opposed to whether they're a queen or warrior or so on. So exercise 1 was figuring out who the characters are, and obviously that is easier for the book I've already written. I mentioned when I was going through the steps that I preferred the function approach rather than the archetype approach, and this was definitely true for this book. The main challenge I had is that I'm not sure who the hero is, because when I originally wrote this, I had 4 point of view characters. Now I have 3. One is the opponent and the other 2 are like the heroes of the story. But if I want to commit to one being the protagonist, I'm not sure, because I've been going back and forth on it a little bit, and one of them morally is a better protagonist for the antagonist because they are on 2 sides of like the moral issue of the book. But the other one, as far as the MacGuffin's concerned, is a better protagonist because he and the antagonist both really want the MacGuffin. So it's a little challenging. So what I've been doing is approaching the exercises from both angles. So for the function approach, the hero is either Perry or Aubrey, the opponent is Jaredon. Second opponent varies depending on who the hero is. The ally is obviously each of the heroes, depending on who the hero is. So if Perry is the hero, Aubrey is the ally, and vice versa. For fake ally opponent, Perry has one which is Madara, who's her best friend, who's actually in cahoots with the opponent, but I was going to say Perry doesn't know that until the end, but the thing is, in the book I wrote, she does know that. So if you've been watching these videos, you'll know that I have this book that I wrote, and every time I do these exercises, it highlights all of the reasons why it didn't work. So I haven't really figured out a good way to approach these exercises yet, whether I approach it as if I'm drafting something from scratch or whether I approach it trying to make the book I have work. And one of the ways I keep approaching this is like it's a puzzle, and if I just stare at all the pieces long enough, I'll find a way to make them fit. And what I'm worried about is that it's 5 puzzles and I've just dumped all of the pieces onto the table and I'm trying to make them all fit, but they're not going to fit because they're different puzzles. This is what I'm worried is the situation. So I've sort of been doing half-half, like I've been starting with what I have and then either finding out what the problems are and going, okay, future Jackie can figure that out, or trying to do it again to address the problems, and I haven't quite found a solution yet. But in any case, even if I don't find the solutions, I think it's still helpful to go through the exercise because all of this is forcing me to think about the book in a way that I haven't thought about it before. And even if I get to the end of Anatomy of Story and still don't have the answers, at least I've done the thinking, and then maybe I don't know, maybe then I've gotten like the gunk out and I can go back and do it again, like with more of a clean slate. Anyway, if some of the things I say with this book don't make sense, that is why. So yes, Perry has a fake ally opponent who's her best friend, but turns out to be working for the bad guy. Aubrey doesn't have a fake ally opponent, and neither of them have a fake opponent ally. One of the things John Truby talks about in this chapter is if you have multiple heroes, multiple protagonists, and if he recommends choosing one of them because that's best for having like more forward momentum in the story, whereas if you have multiple protagonists and they each have their own desire line, that can really damage momentum because you start moving forward with one and then stop because you've got to visit another one. So So one of the questions he asks is, if you need to choose one, is which one has the strongest desire line? And I think that's Aubrey because he wants the MacGuffin, which sets the plot in motion. But when it comes to the moral question, which is supposed to be the big thing of the story, like I said, that's more Perry. And Aubrey isn't so much a part of this world, he just ends up coming into like the world, which is the university/town where the book is set for the book. So it's a bit of a conundrum. When it comes to the archetypes one, I did start this and then it just wasn't working. So for the king or father archetype, there's Rain, who's like the headmaster of the university/ruler of the town. For the other archetypes, there wasn't really anyone. Like there was a potential person who could be the mentor or teacher, a potential person who could be the trickster, but yeah, it didn't really work for me, so I think functions is the way I'm going to go. For the character web exercise of DID Mystery, I did a little bit differently because, as you know, the Anatomy of Story has either approaching it by story function or archetype, But with DID, there are actually certain, I don't want to use the word archetypes, there are certain roles that the different alters often take in the system. So when I say system, that is the group of alters that live within a body, and the alters are the different like personalities, if you want to use the multiple personality terminology. In more modern literature, I believe alters stands for alternate states of consciousness, so it's basically the different people who are sharing this body. And those alters do take different roles, so I actually started this by thinking about what are the common roles they take and which ones would have a place in this story, because there are a lot that you can have. It's not uncommon for people with DID to have tens, maybe even hundreds of different alters, which isn't going to work for the purposes of this book because each alter is basically a separate character. It's not one part of like the main personality, if you like. It is a completely distinct person, and there's not going to be room in a single book for a cast of characters that large. So when it comes to the different roles I'm going to be using, the first one is the host. That is the one who most frequently uses the body. It may be the person who was originally born into the body, so before the personality was fragmented. However, that might not necessarily be the case. For my book, I'm thinking it'll be the person who was born into the body, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter that much, so we're just calling them the host role. The next role is protector. So protector is someone whose role is to like protect the system and its alters. There may often be different roles of protectors, so verbal protector, physical protector, emotional protector, and sexual protector. And these people protect the system from different types of abuse. The next role is a persecutor. So a persecutor is someone who actively harms the body. This isn't necessarily because they're evil so much. It might be because they're trying to protect the body. They might believe that if they can control the system, they'll prevent external abuse from happening. Or if they hurt the body, then no one else can hurt them like more or worse. So that's another role we're going to have. There's a memory holder. So that's an alter that holds certain memories, usually memories of trauma. There's a gatekeeper. Gatekeeper is similar to a protector in a sense, but it's more this alter controls access to the front. So when someone's at the front, that means they're in control of the body. And if you have a system with dozens of different alters and all of them are trying to get to the front, that can obviously be a bit chaotic. It's going to be difficult for the body or the system to live out a normal life. So the gatekeeper controls access. They are often very close to the front because of this, so they're often the only alter that witnesses everything that's happening to a system. So in most cases, an alter comes to the front and they're experiencing life through the body when they're at the front, but when they're not at the front, they don't know what's happening with the body. So they're living in what's called the inner world. The gatekeeper, because they're controlling access, they're often aware of everything. And then finally, I also want to have a little. A little is a child alter. And before going on with the exercise, if you are interested in learning more about DID, there are a number of awesome channels on YouTube. Dissociated is one that I love. She hasn't posted in a while at the time of me recording this video due to personal issues and taking care of the system, but she has a debunking DID series as well as all about alters series, which are really helpful. Multiplicity in Me is another one that I like, but there are plenty of them out there, so in general it's far better to learn from the people who are actually experiencing this than me who's trying to learn it secondhand. So if you are curious, please check them out. Oh, and also there are far more roles and functions and types of alters than this, but these are the ones I think I'm going to have in this book. So once I went through that list and went, okay, these are the different alters I want to have, then I went to the story function exercise. So the hero is the main difficult role here, because if the point of view is continually switching between different alters, I'm not sure if any one of them is the hero or if there's a way. And I can't really position the system as the hero because they are distinct characters, and I know I definitely don't want them working together or in much communication early in the book. So for now I've just made the hero the host alter, but that might change. The main opponent is the murderer, obviously, and then there are a few external characters outside of the system relating to the murder mystery. So the opponent is the murderer. There's a second opponent who's a police investigator, who I think might be the fake ally opponent role. I'm also going to have like a psychologist, just because I think it would be helpful for explaining like some of how all of this works if we have that sort of interaction. The psychologist is the character I know the least about at this stage. And then other than the murderer, police investigator, and psychologist, all of the characters are the different alters. That might change as I start writing, but for now I feel like I think that's 8 or 9 characters, so that's enough to have the core cast decided. Exercise 2 is individualizing them, and this is when we start to draw on some of the stuff we did in the structure chapter. So, to individualize or flesh out your characters, you need to write down what you think is the central moral problem of your story. Compare your hero and all other characters based on these parameters: weakness, need, desire, values, power, status, and ability, and how each faces the central moral problem in the story. When making these comparisons, start with the most important relationship in any story, so between the hero and the main opponent, and then after comparing the hero to the main opponent, compare the hero to the other opponents and then to the allies. Finally, compare the opponents and allies to one another. So this is when it starts to become a web. So you're basically building on each of the characters you've listed by creating a mini profile and then comparing and contrasting them with each other. The first thing to look at was the central moral problem, which for this book is the idea of destruction in the name of progress. So the world in which this book is set is one where there was a history of magic, but that's really been stamped down. There was a war/genocide, both I guess, between about 30 and 20 years before the book started, and they really tried to eradicate magic, particularly this one race which was very powerful. And they wanted to bury that and focus on science and industry. So the book, I don't know if it's actually going to be steampunk, but I originally wanted it to be a bit steampunk, so it's sort of supposed to be like Industrial Revolution focused and knowledge above, I suppose the parallel in our world is knowledge above spirituality, so the age of rationality, if you like. But the problem is they've obviously done really bad things to get to this point. Yes, they're making progress, yes, the world is wealthier, but they've destroyed a race of people in order to do this, and there are still people presenting with magical powers today who are sort of seen as outcasts. So it's like, yes, progress, but at what cost? So that's the central moral question or problem. Then I needed to go through each of my characters and figure out their weakness, need, desire, values, power, status, ability, and how they face the central moral problem. And I'm not going to go through all of them because I'm sure you don't care, but for this book I had 9 different characters to look at. And what was interesting is that of those characters, there are, I'd say, 7 I know really well, and it was quite easy to find those things for everyone. There were a couple of question marks. So Aubrey, who was one of my potential heroes, like, he doesn't really have any interest in the central moral problem other than the fact that he is part of the royal family, so I suppose he's interested in upholding it, but not really because he wants to escape type of thing. So he isn't really engaging with the moral problem, whereas all of the other characters are. The other thing I found though is that I have these 2 characters where one, I couldn't answer any of these questions other than where he stood on the moral problem, but weakness, need, desire, values, power, status, nothing. Like, all I know is that he has a cool outfit and he's intimidating, and like, that's really it. He had a cool scene where I introduced him when I was rewriting it last year, and I didn't really know what to do with him after that. And another character was actually one of the point of view characters from the original draft, and I feel like he still needs to be in this because he's pivotal to the start of the plot. He's involved in like the MacGuffin which sets everything in motion. In fact, he's the one who steals it and ends up in possession of it. But other than that, he's sort of just there, and I'm not sure what to do about it. So I've got these pages where like everyone's written in detail, and then you've got these where it's just sort of the points on one side of the page and then blank, 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 blank. So I obviously need to think about that a bit. Even though that's disheartening though, that is really helpful because I knew I had a problem with these characters when I was trying to write this last year, and I didn't know what to do about it, and now I know why, because I don't have any of this stuff, so that obviously needs to be dealt with in more detail. There's sun coming through above me. There, I think that's better. No! That's really annoying. Anyway, once I'd been through all of those character profiles, I needed to figure out where they all stood on the moral issue, and what worked for me rather than having like this person deals with it in this way, I had more of a continuum with where everyone is, so who's on which extreme. So one extreme you've got technology/progress at all costs, and on the other end you've got magic, history, like that sort of let's protect and bring back what was. And so you've got the antagonist at one end, which is defending the past and what was. At the other end you have one of the characters who isn't the main character, but is sort of responsible for the world as it is today. And then you have all of the other characters are sort of on this continuum. And what's interesting is that Perry, who's probably going to be the hero because she has something interesting to say about this, she is very much at the end of technology and progress above all else, but she starts to understand the antagonist and realize that there are costs and not all costs might be worth paying by the end of the book. So I think that's really interesting. I like that transition. I'm not sure what that does for the antagonist-protagonist dynamic though. Like, do they still need to be opponents if Perry starts to understand his point of view? So again, flaws with this book. So exercise 2 for DID mystery, I was really worried about because I know nothing about these characters. I've just created a bunch of roles, but it actually went surprisingly well. The most difficult thing was figuring out what the central moral problem of the story was, because if we're looking at the anatomy of story and you're at that bit in the chapter, it goes, list the central moral problem of the story, and if you've done the premise work, you should already know this. And I was like, I don't remember what I did for this book, so I went back to my notes to look at the premise work and I left it blank, so no wonder I don't know what it is. What I'm struggling with here is the word moral, because this is a murder mystery book. We want to catch the murderer, we want to prove the main character's innocence, so I don't really know how to create a moral dilemma beyond that. There is a central dilemma which is around the idea of like connecting with and working with her alters, but I wouldn't call that a moral problem. So I'm working with that at the moment, but I'm also going to keep that in the back of my mind in case there is a more moral angle I can take. But one of the points John Truby makes is there's a central moral problem where the hero needs to make a moral choice, and that shouldn't be an easy choice, such as where there's a clear positive and negative. So in this case it would be turn in the murderer or let him go free. It's like, that's not a difficult choice. Obviously we want to turn in the murderer. So it needs to be a choice between either two positive options or two negative options. So it's really difficult. And he said the options you're choosing between should be as equal as possible. So it's a true dilemma for the protagonist. So because I know, like, I want the internal conflict to be around the host dealing with the idea that she has alters and really resisting that, I thought the choice could be around basically losing herself or protecting herself, which isn't necessarily true. Like, there are plenty of systems that have this healthy level of communication and collaboration between the alters, but from her point of view, she feels like if I give in to my alters, if I surrender to the system, then I'm going to lose myself. Yeah, so the choice is between losing herself and giving into the system, or potentially going away for a crime she didn't commit because she doesn't have the memories of what happened then, because she wasn't the one in the body when the crime was committed. So I feel like, again, not a moral choice, but I feel like that's a pretty good, negative scenario. So that's what I've been working with for the character profiles. For the character profiles, again, I was very nervous when I was going through this, and I was surprised by how much I came up with, given that I was just making these people up off the top of my head. What's interesting, and what I think will work really well, is that a lot of the weaknesses, needs and desires and values, they are similar between the different characters. So there are themes of control, predictability, security, order, and chaos that come up a lot. So for instance, the host, who's the first character we're going to meet, her weakness is she is a bit of a control freak. She's trying to keep everything in control, and she's afraid of her alters and blacking out, i.e. losing control. So her values, control, predictability, security. When we get to the murderer though, he's in the same position. He values the exact same things, but he's in a position of power and he's trying to control her. Then when we get to the investigator, his values are more around like everything being ordered, everything like having clean lines and boxes around everything having its own categorization and label. And that works well because he thinks like she's making up DID. He thinks it doesn't exist, like she's just putting on an act when she switches in front of him. And then when we get to the gatekeeper altar, she's similar. Her values are control and order. She's controlling who gets to the front. She believes that if the altars get access to the front whenever they want, it will be chaos. In fact, she is very much of the same point of view as the host, in that she doesn't think collaboration is possible because, if everyone's just screaming to be heard, nothing will get done. So I found it really interesting how these mirroring values and weaknesses and needs and desires naturally came up. The only real exception was the protector altar, because he's the one who actively wants collaboration and thinks they can be a healthy system, but everyone else is like, no, walls up, walls up, control, security, predictability. We want everything to be measured and managed. So again, it was really uncomfortable going into this exercise, especially because when I compare it to my fantasy hot mess, I already knew all of this information going in and I was just trying to organize it, and admittedly I was figuring out what all the problems were, but I had a lot to start with, and here I didn't have anything. And it'll be interesting to see how closely I stick to this when I'm drafting, but it was interesting that coming at it from nothing, the themes that naturally came out were consistent and were reflective. So I don't know if that's part of the way the exercise is designed or if I just had a stroke of genius. Who knows? Probably it's John Truby, not me. But yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised. My memory card ran out of space, so if the angle is slightly different now, that is why. The only character I really had difficulty with in this exercise was the psychologist, and I think the reason for that is because the psychologist doesn't really have any impact on the main plot. So maybe they could be like an expert witness for the police. Do cops need expert witnesses, or is that just when you go to court and it's something lawyers need? Anyway, if police need expert witnesses, maybe they could be part of the plot in that way. But in general, the reason I originally thought it would be nice to have a psychologist is, one, it would be nice to have another character outside of the system, and two, if we have a psychologist, it might create some space for conversations about the disorder. And three, I thought it would also be interesting to have someone else who has a different moral or different stance on the moral problem, in which is that this is someone who believes that a healthy relationship with your alters is possible. And that's a fairly unusual stance in this book, given that pretty much everyone except for one of the alters either thinks it isn't real or wants to control everything. So all in all, I'm really happy with how much progress I made. Then there is a whole section on creating your hero, which involves 1, meeting the requirements of a great hero, so they need to be constantly fascinating. You need to make the audience identify with them, you need to make the audience empathize with them, and you need to give them a moral as well as a psychological need. Now, I don't know how much of that I'm going to do here, to be completely honest, because I feel like a lot of this, make your character fascinating, make the audience identify with them, make them empathize with them, that happens in the writing process. And it feels a little bit artificial to me to go, okay, I'm going to make people like this character because they have this trait or this interest. Whereas I feel like if your motivations are clear enough, then, and the writing's good enough, then your audience will identify with the character. I think what I'm trying to say is it's hard to establish this in advance. It comes through in the writing. So yeah, I might skip that one. We'll see how I go. Now, this is only step 1 of creating the hero. Step 2 of creating the hero is character change. So basically how they change throughout the book. What's their transition from the beginning of the book to the end? Creating your hero, step 3, is desire. And then creating your hero, step 4, is the opponent. So this comes back to the idea of it being a web. How does your opponent reflect your hero? So what he says is you need to make the opponent necessary, make him human, give him values that oppose the values of the hero. Exercise 3 was around building out your hero, and that exercise had a number of sub-steps. So the first one was making sure your hero met the requirements of being a hero, which was they need to be likable, your audience have to identify with them, their audience needs to empathize, not necessarily sympathize with them, and they need to have this moral and psychological need. Now, I'm going to skip this, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to skip it for all the books, because as I mentioned earlier, I think this is something that it comes up in the writing. Like, I can't just say at this stage, people are going to like my character because she's clumsy or quirky or whatever. Like, it'll come through in the writing and how everything is expressed. So that brings us on to step 2 of developing your hero, which is about character change. And I'm still approaching this first book from the perspective of I'm not entirely sure who the hero is out of the 2 characters, so I've looked at both of them. John Truby actually lists a number of typical changes heroes can go to. So if I look at the book, there's the child to adult transition, or the coming of age story, adult to leader, cynic to participant, leader to tyrant, leader to visionary, and then a literal metamorphosis. So someone turns into like a different character, like Jekyll and Hyde, or something like Kafka's Metamorphosis, where the guy turns into a bug, and so on. So I think for this story, both Aubrey and Perry, they're like university students, so it's a child to adult type of change. For both of them, I think it's about going from certain rigid beliefs about the world to understanding that things are more nuanced than they originally thought. And then that leads to them having new moral beliefs by the end of the story. As I mentioned earlier, Perry actually moves from being at the extreme of progress at all costs continuum to understanding where the antagonist is coming from, even if she's not going to go all the way back to let's restore the past. The next thing is the desire line, and this is something I've struggled with for this book, but I think I struggle with in general because it came up in Powerless, where the desire at the beginning of the book was different to the desire at the end of the book. Like at the beginning of the book, Hannah wanted to prove herself, she wanted to be accepted by her father, she believed she needed powers to do that, so then she wanted powers, then she discovered that her father's a bad guy and she needs to take him down. So I feel like there's a clear evolution in what she wants, but I don't know if that meets John Truby's requirements for a clear desire line, because it's similar with this book actually, because the desire line for both of them is to like find the MacGuffin initially. The quest for the MacGuffin leads them to see what the opponent is doing, in that he wants to basically stage a revolution and destroy everything, destroy what's been built over the last 20 years. And then ultimately, I'm not sure what they want beyond that. Like once they stop the opponent, what'll be next? I think it's too simple for them to want to defeat the opponent and then preserve the world the way it is now, because both of them do become older and wiser. They realize that the world they have today has come at a very large cost, and that's probably not the best way of doing things. So I'm not sure what their ultimate goal will be. Having said that, this is just for this book, and for this book they need to get rid of the antagonist. So maybe it's not something that I need to figure out now. It's more that if there are sequels, and this is one where I always imagined it being a trilogy, like I need to figure it out for the next book. The fourth step in creating your hero is creating your opponent, because your hero is defined in opposition to your opponent. So the opponent then had 4 separate steps you needed to look at. The first one was to make him necessary, and by being necessary, the opponent is the one who is best able to attack the weakness of the hero. This is a little challenging because, and again, it's a reason why this book didn't work, because ultimately, other than sort of being annoyed by her, the opponent in this book doesn't really have any personal beef with the hero. Sheridan does not have any strong issues with Perry, but she sort of represents his nemesis. She is the daughter figure of his nemesis, Rain, so he can attack her as a way of getting to Rain. I don't know if that's enough though, or if there needs to be something personal between these two. So this then raises the question of, are these the best heroes for this book? Or should Rain be the hero of this book? And I'd say no, because I feel like Rain and Jeridan's story is what happened in the past. It's what happened 20 to 30 years ago. Maybe there's a prequel trilogy if I ever get this one written. But it does create a problem now where the opponent isn't actually attacking the hero, he's attacking the system or the world which the hero's father figure built. So I don't know if that works or if I need to completely take it apart. So this is going to be very similar to the premise video where I asked if you've done the anatomy of story, if you have a good understanding of character and how character should be approached, how opponent-hero dynamic should be approached, please let me know if you think this works, or if it does need to be a direct confrontation between the two. The next piece is simply to make the opponent human, which I don't think I have a problem with. I don't think I've ever written a character who's, all-powerful. So by being human, John Truby says, the opponent has certain weaknesses that are causing him to act wrongly towards others. So yes, in this case, the opponent just has so much anger about the past that it's clouding his judgment. Like the hero, he has a need based on those weaknesses. Yes, he needs to be able to let go of that anger in order to have the potential for a fulfilling life going forward, because at the moment he is consumed by this and his need for revenge or justice, as he calls it. He must want something, preferably the same goal as the hero. Here things get a little bit awkward because they both initially want the MacGuffin at the beginning. The opponent wants it because it's a powerful tool, because it's a MacGuffin. The hero wants it because she gets given it and then loses it and doesn't want to get in trouble. So they both want the same thing at the beginning. The opponent gets the MacGuffin and then wants to use it to stage this revolution, which you can position as wanting to take over the city, own the soul of the city, whereas the hero wants to protect that. So you could argue that they're both fighting over the rule of the city. So even though the hero doesn't personally want it for herself, they are fighting over the same thing. But again, this is where you get into, well, the opponent is really the opponent of the hero's father figure as opposed to her opponent. So does it work? Or I don't know, it was just maybe the opponent should have a son or something and they can go against each other, but that's just getting into really bad Disney sequel territory where the characters from the first movie have children and the children enact the same story as the parents did. So we're not going to do that, but I need to figure out if it works or if we can have something personal between them. See, one of the challenges with this, and with any craft book actually, is I find I get so focused on doing the exercises themselves and just answering the question that I don't have the time to go away and do this thinking, because this thinking isn't always, I can come up with an answer to this question. Whether it's the best answer is debatable, but because I'm trying to go through this list of things that need to be done, I don't take the time to go off and think about all of these other questions that come up. So, yeah, interesting. Not specific to the anatomy of story, but something to keep in mind if you're new to craft books. Step 3 of the opponent was give him values that oppose the values of the hero, and this is where we get into that progress at all costs versus preserving the past in history and magic. That is the continuum they're on. The hero does actually adjust and learn to be more moderate. The opponent doesn't. That's why he loses. So I think that works. The opponent needs a strong but flawed moral argument, and I think, yes, he does have this. So Jaredon believes that Rain was wrong to lead the genocide 30 years ago that stamped out magic. He wants to restore mages and magic to their former glory. The flaw is that he wants to destroy everything Rain has built and the progress the world has made since then. So what's a little bit ironic is that the reason the world's in this position is because you had this group of people who believed in progress at all cost and they need to stamp out the past, and they sort of used this group of mages as a scapegoat. Then you got this guy who wants to preserve the past. He wants to return things to the way they are, but he's also taking on the we've got to do it at all costs mentality as opposed to compromise. So, strong argument. These guys were in the wrong, not arguable, but this guy is going about punishing them and restoring the past in the wrong way. Then there are certain similarities between the opponent and the hero. So I think both of them have a certain rigidness in their thinking. They're both very righteous. They both believe, of this continuum, they both believe that their side is right. They both have a love of Daramon, which is the town/university where this is set. Jaredon loves the historical Daramon. It was actually something his family built, whereas Perry loves it currently because it's her home, it's all she's ever known. As an engineer and someone who loves progress, it's also the leading place in the world to be if you're building trains and exciting things. And then the final thing you need to do with your opponent is keep them in the same place as the hero. And this is fairly easy because they're both in this university town. Jaredon is there because it's his family's legacy, he's never going to leave. Perry's there because like, she's studying, she doesn't actually have any family outside of the town, so there's nowhere else for her to go. Not that she's actively looking to go anywhere, so they're naturally in the same place as opposed to being stuck in the same place. I've been doing the hero exercises for my DID mystery book, and I've run into a bit of a problem, and it's not the problem I expected, because originally I thought that I was going to struggle because there's no one hero, because the book changes points of view. So I thought, for the sake of doing the exercise, I might as well start with the first character we're going to meet, which is going to be the host of the system, who I'm calling Diana for the time being. And again, I skipped the first exercise about the hero being fascinating, about people being able to identify with them, about them being able to empathize with them, and about them having a moral/psychological need, because the first three, again, I think they're going to come out in the writing, and the last one sort of has already been done in the previous exercises. So that brings us to character change, and this change I'd already figured out in the previous exercise, which is that, you know, she's scared of sort of losing control, blacking out. She doesn't trust her alters, even though she knows she has this disorder. And to try and avoid them taking control, she maintains like rigid control over her life. The problem is that rather than giving her more control or putting her in a position of power, this leaves her in a position of weakness, because she's vulnerable to them and doesn't really know how to, she doesn't know how to see the signs of when she's going to switch. She has no connection or communication with them, so she doesn't know what she might be missing when she's not in the body, and so on. In the context of this book, this stops her from being able to catch the killer, because different alters are getting different clues. So by the end of the book, the change is that she learns to accept and start to work with her alters, and that gives her the information she needs to catch the killer. So character change, I think that works. Desire is to catch the killer / prove her innocence, because she is going to be a suspect. And then we get into the opponent section, which is the final subsection of exercises under this developing a compelling hero section of the chapter. So first, the opponent needs to be necessary. I think I'm going to make him, they're going to have a personal relationship. I think maybe a stepfather. The thing is, I do have a tendency to make father figures my villains, I've realized, and I don't know if I want to do that with another father figure, and I have a very good relationship with my own father, in case you're wondering. But at the moment I'm thinking he is someone she's known since childhood. He is one of her abusers from when she was young, so he knows how to push her, he knows how to gaslight her, making her doubt herself. So I want to have this dynamic where he's making her think that maybe she is the killer and she just wasn't, at the front. She wasn't the one in control of the body when it happened. Yeah, in terms of being necessary, that means he needs to be the one who is best able to attack the hero's weaknesses, which I think, yes, if they've got that historical relationship, that is true. The next one is the antagonist needs to be human. And I think, yes, because all of my characters are very human. But from the hero's or first character we meet's point of view, I think he's going to seem like infallible almost. So I'm considering whether we have other characters aside from the alters have point of view chapters, because I'm thinking the opponent could be a policeman or some role in the police force. He's not investigating this case, but he's connected to the investigator who is. So perhaps if we can see someone else who has a relationship with this guy, we can see his more human elements. I need to play with that a little bit though. Where I ran into trouble was values, because when I was doing the little character profiles earlier, he and the hero have the exact same values. So they value control, predictability, security. The difference is that she sort of wants control over her own life, whereas he wants to control others. So maybe that's enough of a difference. But the problem is when we look at the chapter, in fact, if I go back to the body of the chapter, okay, so make him necessary, make him human, then the value step is actually give him values that oppose the values of the hero. So I don't know if they're allowed to have the same values almost, or if is it enough for them to have the same values but approach them in different ways? Or do they actually need to have different values? Because what it says here is the actions of the hero and the opponent are based on a set of beliefs or values. These values represent each character's view of what makes life good. In the best stories, the values of the opponent come into conflict with the values of the hero. Through that conflict, the audience sees which way of life is superior. Much of the power of the story rests on the quality of this opposition. So that implies that they should not have the same values, and in fact, the opponent and hero having different values is what causes them to lock horns. So I'm a little bit stuck here, and this, I don't know if I've mentioned in this video or in an earlier one, but one of the things I've often struggled with when doing character work, especially when you're creating like general character profiles that have nothing to do with the story, is that you create this person who has values and desires and goals and weaknesses and so on that are outside of the current story because they're a complete person. They have a life out of whatever is currently happening. The problem is, in the narrow world of the story you're trying to tell, all of that might not be relevant. And I'm worried that here I've tackled the values from too general a point of view rather than the focus of this story, because the focus of this story is it starts with a dead body and there's a murder investigation. So, what they want from life in general might not necessarily be as relevant. So, yeah, I'm not sure about that. One of the challenges of this chapter specifically, though, is that there is a lot of information in the chapter that's not included in the summary pages at the end of the chapter, which list all of the writing exercise steps you need to take. So unless you know this book really well, I think one of the weaknesses is you can't go straight to the exercises at the end of the book because they don't cover everything. For instance, I was going through the exercises at the end of the chapter and I happened to jump back into the chapter to check a couple of things, and one of the things you need to look at is the hero's character change. That is in this list of exercises. However, in the chapter, there's a whole section on the moment of revelation, so the moment that change happens, which is not in these exercises at the end. So that's something I haven't actually done for either of the books that I've done these exercises for so far because it wasn't in the summary. Similarly, with these values, so what I just read to you was that the opponent and the hero should have opposing values. That's what causes conflict. Here in the exercise, it says, opponent's values. List a few values for each opponent. How is each opponent a kind of double for the hero? Give each some level of power, status, and ability, and describe what similarities each shares with the hero. So this sort of contradicts what I just said, because this says they are supposed to be similar. So I'm not sure what to do. I don't know if I need to change what I had in mind or just, sort of chalk this up to, that's an interesting, disconnect or minor inconsistency in this book and move on. So anyway, in the opponent exercises on values, I got a little bit stuck because they're supposed to be in conflict with the hero. So I'm going to think a little bit more. I really like them having the same values though, like both wanting control, but him wanting control of everything and her just wanting control of her life. Like, I really like that. So we'll see. The next thing with the opponent is looking at their moral argument. So they should have a strong but flawed moral argument. And I don't have one for this book because, basically he killed someone and he's trying to frame someone else to take the fall. I'm not really sure what moral argument there is there. Unless they're really deluding themselves, but I think I like my characters to have some self-awareness. Maybe I'm too self-aware. I struggle to identify with characters who are so clearly deluding themselves just because I don't do that, even though, clearly it's a thing if it exists so much in fiction. But I don't know if I could write a character who lacks so much self-awareness that he somehow convinces himself that, I don't know, he is sending this girl to prison for her own good. I don't know, maybe it can come from he thinks she's a danger to herself and society because of the disorder, but that feels really weak to me, and it's also not the message I want to send with this book. So that's blank for now. So question for the comments, what do you think is a strong moral argument for a man who has killed someone and is trying to blame someone else to take the fall for his crimes? What sort of moral argument can he make that he is in the right by doing that? Please let me know your thoughts below. I would be curious to hear what you think. And then the final piece is the similarities between the opponent and the hero, which, as I've mentioned, they already have these mirroring values, but maybe values is one of the areas where they're not meant to be similar. So yeah, I'm a little bit stuck on this because I was really happy when I realized that they valued the same things, and now I don't know if it's the wrong thing. The final section in the Anatomy of Story chapter on character is about building conflict, and the idea is that conflict makes a story more interesting, so therefore we should multiply that by 5 billion. Which might be a bit of an exaggeration, but basically John Truby has this model where rather than having your hero and opponent in direct conflict with each other, you create conflict between the hero, the opponent, and the minor opponents, and then create conflict between each of those opponents as well. So rather than the hero just being in conflict with everyone, everyone's in conflict with each other. So he calls this the four-corner opposition method, where you draw out a chart, and in one corner you have the hero, in another corner you have your first opponent, in another corner you have your second, and in another corner you have your third. And then you can draw lines between them representing the conflict between each of these characters. And as I said, it's not just conflict between the hero and each of those opponents, but each of those opponents should have conflict between them as well. In order to create this chart successfully, you need to follow a number of steps. The first one is that each opponent should have a different way of attacking the hero's weaknesses. The second is all characters are in conflict, not just the hero and the opponent. The third is the values of the characters should also be in conflict, not just the characters themselves. The fourth step is to push the characters into the corners of the chart. So once you figure out what the values conflict is, you give the hero an extreme version of the value and the opponent the opposite extreme of the same value, so they're complete opposites. And then the final step is to extend this approach to different levels of the world you've built. So you might have this four-corner opposition within a friendship group or a family, then you might have it within a company or institution, then you might have it within the wider world. So basically every sort of social structure you have within your book, you should be able to apply this method to it. This has not been easy, to be completely honest. I've been working on this for a couple of weeks now, obviously not consistently, but I think I first tried this exercise about 2 weeks ago now, maybe 3, but I have picked it up a couple of times since then, and for my fantasy hot mess, I'm really struggling to get anywhere because I can come up with a chart where there are people in each of the four corners, but generally there will be one pair of characters on that chart where it doesn't make sense to have a line between them because there's no direct conflict between them. So of the, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different conflict lines in that chart, I only have 5. And I've tried this with a number of different characters and it tends to be the same every time. There's always one where one pair of characters are not in conflict. So I'm not sure, like most of the things in this book, I'm not sure if me not being able to do it is a problem or if it's like okay. Like how big a problem is it if I don't have every single pair of characters in opposition? And is it okay for most of them to be in opposition, or do I really need to keep working on this to find a way to make these characters oppose each other? So that's the biggest problem I'm having, and I feel like until I do that, then I can't really do the later steps. So I need to figure out who the core conflicting characters are before I can then confirm their values and push them to the extremes. And I need to have that done before I can go, okay, how does this apply to different like social structures within the book? So what I thought I'd try as a brainstorming tool is to just do a list of each character versus each character and what their primary conflict is. So Perry versus Jordan, hero and opponent, Perry versus Aubrey, so hero versus fake opponent ally, and so on. So I did this for all of the significant characters, and I have 21 different pairings that I need to come up with a conflict for. I'm not expecting I'll come up with conflicts for all of them, but hopefully that'll tell me, 1, whether some characters should just be cut entirely, but 2, which ones deserve all of the development that is involved in completing this tool. But yeah, it's really, this is really challenging, and I felt like I'd already done a lot of good work. I felt like I developed these characters a lot. I had a lot of conflicts, but yeah, getting those conflict between the cast of characters and the protagonist, that's fine because that's already been developed. But trying to think about how each of these characters are relating to each other, that's really tough. I'm at the airport waiting for our flight and I'm trying to do this four-corner opposition exercise again, and I feel like I'm getting somewhere by focusing just on the different values. I don't know if I'm doing it right, but what I'm doing is basically figuring out what each pair of characters' conflict is. So that means rather than just having like 4 extremes of a single value in a chart, I have a lot. So, for example, if I go with Perry, who's one of the potential heroes, Jaredon, who's the opponent, Rain, who's a secondary character, like a secondary opponent or fake ally opponent, and then Madara, who's a fake ally opponent. On the Perry-Jaredon opposition, we've got magic versus science. The Rain-Jaredon opposition is also magic versus science. Perry versus Madara is like knowledge for the sake of knowledge versus knowledge to gain power. Perry to Rain is obedience or even blind faith versus questioning. And then Rain to Madara, that's like the scale of oppression / obedience to freedom. I don't know if all of those things should be in the same table, but I think it's working. What this has highlighted though is that I do have a couple of characters who need some serious work. There are 2 characters in particular who don't really seem to have any place in the book when it comes to coming into conflict with the others, so I either need to think about how to generate some conflict around them or potentially try mapping out the book without them entirely. And I'm not sure when to do that. I think that's the biggest question I have at the moment is, do I do that now while I'm working on character, or do I just continue working, keep this in the back of my mind, and then when I get to the plot chapter later, see how the story maps out with and without these characters? All in all though, I am happy with the progress I've made. I've done 2 different 4-corner opposition tables based on the main characters in this book, and I've left out the difficult ones. I don't know if it's possible for me to do this with every single character, given that some of them are quite minor, or whether that just means those characters don't belong. So I think I'm going to continue to mull over this, but I might call this the end of the process for this book in this vlog, because I have a feeling this is already getting quite long. So I've tried doing the 4-corner opposition for my DID mystery book, and what's interesting is that the challenge I'm having here is completely the opposite to the challenge I was having with my fantasy hot mess. In that, in this book, it's actually fairly easy to put different characters onto the chart and see how they all come into conflict. So I've got our hero, the host of the system, in one corner. I've got the opponent / murderer in the other corner. I've got the police investigator in the 3rd corner. And then in the 4th corner, I've got 2 characters because I think either of them work well. So I've got the memory holder role in the system as well as the gatekeeper role. And the reason these all work is because Diana, our main character, and our murderer, they're obviously in conflict. She wants to find the murderer, he wants to frame her and get off scot-free. Then we've got the police investigator, so he is in conflict with our hero because he thinks she might have done it. He doesn't believe that this DID thing is a thing. But he also, without realizing it, is in conflict with the murderer because he's the investigator. He wants to catch the murderer. He doesn't want to be caught. Then in this 4th corner, we have Christine, which is the name I'm working with as the memory holder. So she is technically in conflict with the others because she holds the memory of the murder. She saw what happened and like no one else knows because she's hidden within the system. Like, yeah, she's traumatized. She's not coming out. So she's in direct conflict with the main character because she has the information the main character needs. She's in conflict with the police investigator because she has the information about who the murderer is. And my brilliant plan is falling apart because she isn't technically in conflict with... I suppose she is in conflict with the murderer because he's also the abuser and he's the reason that she's traumatized and has gone into hiding. So there, that works. The other one I have in this corner is the gatekeeper one. So she's the one who sort of has the most control and insight over the system and has a lot of control over who gets to the front. So the gatekeeper is in conflict with Diana because even though it's sort of like a fake ally opponent situation because Diana wants things to be in control. She doesn't want people taking over, but this is stopping her from getting the information she needs to solve the crime. So that's a conflict. She's in conflict with the investigator because by controlling access to the front and the flow of information, he's not getting the information he needs to solve the crime. And again, this is one where the conflict with the murderer is a little bit shaky, I suppose, you know, because of past trauma. He's the one who created the situation. But anyway, I think even if we remove the gatekeeper and just keep Christine there, I feel like that is all fairly solid. Like everyone's against everyone else. So I was really happy with how easily that came together. Where I ran into trouble was when I then needed to look at putting their values in conflict because, as I mentioned in the last exercise, they don't really have conflicting values. They all share values. There are a lot of similarities in these characters. So I don't really know what to do for this, whereas in my fantasy hot mess, that was the easier part because there was sort of this continuum of the old versus the new where everyone was on this path and it was easy to see how they all sat on this spectrum, if it makes sense. Whereas here we've got, people who have the same thing. So you've got the hero and the opponent both valuing control. You've got the investigator and the gatekeeper both valuing order. And I'm not sure what to do about that because if I look at the opposite value, so for control, I was looking at like vulnerability or even openness, I could make that Diana's value as in what she needs to aspire to get to by the end of the book, which would put her and the opponent in a values conflict. But it's not really a conflict because, she doesn't have those values at the beginning. So it's not like they're each fighting to uphold their way of life. And when it comes to order down at this level, the opposite is chaos, but it wouldn't make sense for either of those characters to want chaos. So this is, really challenging, and I'm not sure what the solution is, because where I am now, and admittedly this is obviously the beginning of the process, I haven't written this yet, so I can change everything. But the thing is, if I try to change this here, that fundamentally changes these characters. Yeah, I just don't see a way it would work. If we're going with, and I think control and openness and order and chaos are the best values for this present discussion, if we suddenly introduce chaos into the mix, I don't know how we're going to have any time to get a story written. So for this book, I'll let it marinate over the next couple of days, but I don't actually know if I'm going to be able to do the values part of this exercise because it doesn't make sense unless I want to completely throw out the original idea. So we're still at the airport and I've actually decided not to continue doing the character chapter for my Happily Ever After book, which is the one about the villain who tries to take over heaven. And the reason for that is because I started doing the exercises and I still wasn't getting any more ideas on how to flesh out the story and who should be in it. And it's kind of strange because when I was thinking about which 3 ideas I wanted to try this process on, I was originally deciding between Happily Ever After and the other one I plotted for NaNoWriMo last year, so Vampire Board Games. And I was originally going to go with the Vampire Board Games one. And then for some reason, in the first week of October, I had some sort of idea that inspired me about Happily Ever After. I went, okay, I'm going to do that one. And then since then, I haven't really been able to think of anything else. So that's a bit of a shame, but I feel like I've got plenty to work on in between my fantasy hot mess and DID mystery. And I feel like because one's a brand new idea and one's already been written, it does give me 2 different perspectives on how the anatomy of story process works. So all in all, I'm quite happy with that decision. When it comes to the chapter on character, I do feel like that was a really good one for me. I think I was surprised at how easy the early exercises were when it came to figuring out who each of the characters were and individualizing them. I found that it was really easy to start building people out. The thing that was most challenging, which I'm sure you gathered, was the 4-corner opposition exercise and figuring out how to put all of the characters in opposition rather than just the opponent. I'm going to continue working on that. One concern I have about it is that if everyone's against each other, how is anything going to get done? People do need to cooperate at some point in order for the story to move forward. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. How do you tackle everyone having some sort of conflict while driving the story forward? Other than that, if you're doing NaNoWriMo, please leave me a comment to let me know how you're going. Give me a big thumbs up. If you like this video, remember to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and do everything that will keep YouTube happy, and I will see you next time. Bye.